Sailors, people working at sea, what's the most creepy or most amazing sight you witnessed? Oftentimes in the Navy I'd stand on the fantail and watch the ocean. Once we had hundreds, probably around 400 dolphins riding the carrier's wake. They followed us for 3 days. In the middle of the Pacific. It's so dark and there's so little light pollution. You can see reds, browns and faint blues of gas clouds in the starscape. Another time I was watching the water at night. They say it draws you in. And it really does. You look at this pitch-black void, with only the wake or turbulence of the water catching light, and intrusive thoughts of jumping in just naturally occur. It's mesmerizing, especially if you're alone. At night during one of these events I saw blue glowing water. What I now know was bioluminescent algae. And inside this rather massive patch of blue glowing water were squid. That appeared to be maybe 15-20 foot long. You could catch their outline by the light from the water. I stared at what was multiple squid passing by for minutes. What seemed like an eternity, and then the light started going away in the spot I was staring. There was still a lot of glowing water. We weren't headed out of it. But this patch gets darker and darker and darker until pitch black. A solid 15 seconds of intense curiosity. Suddenly a lot of turbulence and a whale surfaces. It had snatched up all the squid. The whale cocked to one side and looked at the ship. And our eyes met, I want to think. It studied the ship for a moment until just sinking back down until the glow of the water masked it completely. The northern lights in the middle of nowhere, Alaska. We were anchored in a remote cove. So the CO agreed to turn off all the exterior lights. Just a crazy thing to see. On a boat in Alaska recording humpback whale sounds. We picked up an odd, rhythmic noise on the hydrophone. We were on a 100 feet schooner around Admiralty Island, near Juneau. Nothing seen on the surface. Just this odd repetitious mechanical sound. The skipper contacted the local authorities, who seized the tape and spent several hours interviewing him. Not that scary, but surely weird. I came across a man who'd hung himself on his boat 5 or 6 miles offshore about 4 or 5 years ago. The eerie and truly creepy part was realizing what it was. We just saw a boat out in the middle of ocean's nowhere without anything other than blue horizon in sight, at the break of dawn. And there was fairly thick fog, as it had rained the night before. Realizing that the figure hanging from the boom was a man was one of the most haunting things I'll ever see. I was engineer and first mate on a converted LCM-80. LCM-8. In the fish trade, we operated in the Gulf of Alaska, Prince William Sound, and Bristol Bay fisheries as a tender, taking salmon and herring from smaller boats and villages in for processing on land. We had a regular spool windlass on the back, and for some reason, the company thought this made us equipped to tow a 220-foot barge from Whittier up through the Aleutian Islands at False Pass, and around to Bristol Bay and back each year. The Gulf of Alaska can be a cruel place sometimes. And at 4 knots max speed towing the barge, we got caught in a doozy. We tried sheltering behind an island. Can't remember. We were working our way up the Aleutian Peninsula. But even so we're unable to hold against the wind and got pulled out. The little windlass on the back deck was getting pulled off and ripping a hole in the engine room. In the process, eventually, in 25-foot seas, we let go the barge and just tracked it and followed it on radar, figuring we'd recover it when things calmed down in a few days. In the horrific days that followed, during which I must have vomited twice my body weight lol, we nearly got rolled once and took on about 10,000 gallons of water in one of our compartments. So, good times. On the last really bad night, I was on watch in the wheelhouse while the captain slept. About 3 a.m., and we were rolling 33-37 degrees, losing 2 knots against the gale by the Loran. Yes, it was a while ago lol. With the barge popping in and out on radar about 4 miles in our lee. Suddenly, the whole ship reverberated and shook with a thunderous boom, and I was sure we were done. We'd obviously hit something hard. I woke the captain and the deckhand. Our entire crew lol. 15 minutes later. Still no sign of flooding in any compartments or other alarms. But I noticed the Loran lost signal. And I wasn't having any luck on the SSB trying to call in for a possible rescue. Yeah, right lol. The deck lights wouldn't come on. And we had a couple of popped breakers in the nav lights. After a while, it became obvious we weren't sinking. So we went about our watches just keeping an eye on things. At first light, I roped off and went on deck to see WTF. And then I saw what had happened. The WW2 surplus LCM-80. Vietnam-era LCM-8. Sorry, I misremembered that. Had a deck house at bulwark level. And a pilot house and stateroom built above that. So the roof of the pilot house was a good 25 feet above the water. Mounted to the steel of the pilot house was a 4-inch steel pipe that went up a few feet to a 3-inch steel crossmember, forming a large T on which our radio and navigation antennas, as well as our mast lights, were mounted. It was gone. The whole thing, bent over at 90 degrees and broken off as if by the hand of God himself. Also gone were the life rafts, which were also mounted on the roof structure. The massive 4-inch steel mast had been bent over and torn off. It wasn't like it was corroded and just broke. There was obviously massive force involved, and even the reinforced steel plate of the mast step on the cabin roof was distorted. It took us about a week, but eventually the seas abated and we were able to bring the barge in under tow to the shelter of the peninsula once again. We made the next 1,000 miles without much except flat seas and beautiful vistas. Such is the life of the mariner. When we eventually got into Dillingham, everyone was quite surprised as we had been declared lost at sea. And the Coast Guard had already given up the search days before. Both our life rafts had been found empty with their EPIRBs deployed. And we were all assumed dead. I still have no idea what monstrous thing must have reached out of the sea and broken off that mast. But whatever it was inches away from taking out the wheelhouse where I was blindly staring out into the rain-tortured darkness on that night. Shit still haunts me. Edit. Some things I remembered wrong. LCM-8. Not 80-75 feet long with the mods it had. Vietnam era. Not WW2. Set up with a full-height engine room. 2x871 diesels. 1x371 genset. 2x471 genset. Deck house at gunwale level with galley, head, shower, and double stateroom. Above that a pilot house with captain's stateroom. Decked over with tanks and reefer system for fish hauling. In the pitch black of night, in the middle of the vast emptiness of the sea, you see the stars filling the heavens, and more shooting stars than you would expect streaking to the earth with their fiery tails. As your eye draws down to the water, you find that somehow the ocean is darker and emptier than the sky. Your eyes strain for a glimpse of anything, but ultimately you only catch glimpses of strange and mysterious creatures lithely swimming just beneath the surface, occasionally peeking above the surface or triggering flashes of bioluminescence that disappear as suddenly as they appear. I used to work on an Atlantic salmon farm a few miles out to sea. Best job I ever had. Creepy. We were round at the second site, other side of the island to the main site, and this one was being left fallow for a couple years, so just required some maintenance every now and then, was used for storage. Me and my brother were there late afternoon to check some ropes or moorings or something. I can't remember. when all of a sudden there was this really strong electrical, copper smell and the place went silent. It was flat calm. Relatively clear skies, so it wasn't a thunderstorm coming in. For some reason this smell really freaked us both out. And we both felt like we were being watched by something, and there was a kind of strange feeling. Atmosphere to the place where it just seemed off. After a couple minutes it went away and the atmosphere returned to normal. We were pretty glad to get back to the main site, but never experienced anything like that again. Really weird. Awesome. This one is hard to describe. But sometimes we would have to pull super long 18-20 hour shifts at harvest time. This involved starting sometimes at 2 a.m. and working until late in the evening. There wasn't actually loads of work the whole time to do. We just needed to be present for a lot of it and lift a cage net once an hour or so. So we mostly just stood around drinking coffee and talking bollocks. Anyway, I digress. We were starting out one of these mornings in the speedboat heading out to the site. On a really crisp winter night. Not a breath of wind. Super cloudless sky and a hint of aurora above us. Speeding along into the night with my buddies in this beautiful scenery. Nice fancy survival suits on to keep warm. I remember looking up and seeing a huge sky full of stars. And a shooting star burning across the sky out towards the horizon. As I say, I can't really bring it to words. But I've never really felt more alive or happy in my work than that night. In the USCG. Was in the Eastern Pacific in February 2017. The bioluminescence at night was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Sailing the Caribbean, you get the glittering speckles in your wake. But in this water the stern wake glowed very bright. Almost made it pointless to be running darkened ship. The bioluminescence was so much so that even fish in the water activated it. I remember a ghostly, glowing cloud silently move in toward us where we were taking it all in on the fantail. Then just as silently it moved away. We could see larger glowing clouds. Likely a school of fish. Then a glowing streak, maybe tuna or something, come flying into the glowing mass and the school would explode like fireworks underwater. Saw this occur a few times. It was amazing. Another time we were in the Caribbean. Middle of the night at flight quarters. I was on the fire party and we were staged on the forecastle. We were kinda bored waiting for the helicopter come back. All of a sudden this massive meteor hurtles by overhead, completely turning night into day for a second. We were all in disbelief. The people wearing NVGs were a little ticked, though. Was standing topside watch on a dark night when the sky suddenly turned bright. For about 3 seconds something was incoming that lit all the weather decks up like daylight. This sparked quite a reaction on the bridge and in operations. We were forward deployed during wartime, although not in a region where active fighting was expected. For a moment people scrambled, fearing we had been targeted for a surprise missile attack. Then the sky went dark again just as suddenly as it had began, leaving us safe and alone again. Yet there was still a whole bunch of commotion on comms as people jabbered stuff that amounted to Whiskey Tango Foxtrot. The only crew member who saw what had really happened was me. It's a meteor. It's a meteor. It's a meteor. Had to repeat the report several times before anyone paid attention. A meteor had come down almost directly above us, then broken up into 3 pieces as it burned up in the atmosphere. It was like a fireball that put on quite a light show in the ocean on a moonless night at dark 30 in the middle of expletive deleted nowhere. Astronomers call these bolides. It might even have been a superbolide, but it isn't on the list of recorded superbolides. We may have been the only ship that saw it. Based on the time of year and the location, it may have been one of the southern torrids. A meteor shower that's noted for producing fireballs. Not a whole lot of people ever witness a meteor that's spectacular. By lucky coincidence I got a good view of this one. Edited from replying to a similar question 2 years ago. Being out at sea was definitely one of the best experiences of being in the Navy. I got to see the northern lights, a meteor shower, and a blood moon. My favorite pastime was identifying the constellations. Eventually, when I got to learn a significant amount, I was able to tell what direction we were going. I'm seriously grateful I got to experience that. Was on watch and a lookout reported a ship on fire on the horizon. Looked through my binos and saw what they were looking at. Looked like a plume of flame really far away, just over the line of the horizon. Went and consulted the astrobooks and discovered that it was actually moonrise. Crescent moon. The tip of the crescent was coming up over the astronomical horizon, and was bright red-orange. Still very cool. I've also seen the Flying Dutchman illusion. Dolphins swimming through bioluminescent waters that look like glowing torpedoes. Meteor hits near the ship. Lightning hitting the mast. Waterspouts in the Caribbean. And the green flash at sunset. Many more things as well. Being at sea is just plain trippy. Fresh out of college I got a job in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or so they said, as an architect designing whatever. Ended up doing oil rigs, and one beautiful morning there were sharks going under the main platform. Like always, but there were 2 dead sharks. Next morning 3 new dead. Then 4 the next day. Then a steady 4 or 5 a day for a week or 2. They would float up under the see-through deck. That looked much like a metal colander. Crew would have to punch them down so the current could catch them with a large pole. What made it really weird was they looked like they had heart attacks or died in their sleep. No marks or bites or anything. The guys on the rig had all kinds of theories. Then one morning, while in a room that was completely submerged and had a beautiful view as we sat in a meeting, everyone got to see the reason the sharks were dying, like viewing it on a movie screen. This octopus had made itself a home between the base and the deck. A shark was swimming by in a cruising fashion, and we see these tentacles grab it right in front of the glass and snap it like a glow stick. The marine biologist smiled and said, "Octopus is literally doing that to entertain themselves, like because he can." The marine biologist lowered a dive camera, and this octopus was huge. The crew would joke about it thereafter. People would smoke on the deck at night, and people would say, "Don't let the octopus in." Seeing those tentacles was just insane for their length, and to think about how a shark is mostly muscle and the octopus would just snap was kinda scary. Creepiest would be underway on the 31st of October, Halloween Day, off maybe 15 miles off the coast of Florida near Miami. Lookout sights a White House boat, looks like it's just drifting. So we get closer on our fast response cutter, 154 feet, to make contact with them. Nothing. No one responded. Used radio. Loud hailer and ship's whistle. So captain said, "Let's launch our small boat and go investigate." During the small boat mission brief I reminded everyone that it's Halloween Day and this looks just like a horror movie storyline. So the boat launches and the crew gets on board. The doors are closed, but lucky open so the crew can investigate. The boarding team slow conducts its safety sweep while looking any crew on board. So here is a houseboat floating on the ocean with no land in sight, abandoned. So the boarding team marked the vessel with spray paint and left it. Houseboat is probably in Europe if it didn't succumb to the relentless sea. Another time in the middle of the night between midnight and 3 a.m. we start tracking a target of interest. We clearly see someone and at least 2 others on a cabin cruiser. The vessel is unlit, which is a red flag, and steady speed. So we follow it and decide to launch the small boat for pursuit once they are close to U.S. territorial seas. We run our small boat with lights off as well and have night vision goggles to help us see them. I pull up with 15 feet 20 of the vessel and flip the blue lights and spotlight on them. No one is on the boat. All we see is a boat, no one standing up behind the helm or on deck. So I creep up closer, then all of a sudden we see arm hanging over the gunwale. The boarding team starts yelling, "Show us your hands and stand up." No one moved, they were laying on top of each other. So we get the boarding team on board and start checking boat for safety. We transferred all of the 26 migrants off the 35 feet boat on the fast response cutter. 154 feet. Hundreds of sea snakes feasting on the bloated corpse of some kind of animal. I worked on a ferry that crossed a river. 3-minute trip, but a somewhat remote location. I worked alone, from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. all year. In the winter, the darkness was profound. Some mornings I'd show up in the complete darkness. You couldn't see lights from houses or street lights. And it was only as the sky got lighter did you realize you were so fogged in that the end of the boat was even hazy. Some mornings in the spring, when the spiders were going nuts building their webs, and there would be webs all over the cabin door, the gates, the boat, that hadn't been there and I left the night before. From the cold morning dew or fog, there would be water droplets frozen all over them. When I would break a web to get past it, they would fall quickly to the ground and make a clinking sound from all the particles of ice. One time I saw needle ice, where blades of ice grow straight out of the ground. I pulled onto the gravel parking pad in the morning, and saw the needle ice in the dirt. Actually started the ferry late. It was fascinating to look at. I switched to a different boat, and my shift was 3 p.m. to 10 p.m. I remember having a very vivid dream one night, about a deer with huge antlers standing on the end of the ferry in the dark light by the streetlight. 3 nights later, I actually saw that deer. It wasn't on the boat. It was up and back further. But it was like in a movie. Completely silent. Just me and the deer. The whole world dropping away. When spring thaw happened, or huge storms came through, the river would get really high. The boat was attached to an underwater cable, so it wouldn't float away and couldn't go off course. But you could feel the water pushing so hard against it. The current would push the boat as well as the cable downstream that you'd feel the boat struggle to come in for the landing. You'd land, and immediately slide back off. Or you'd look upstream, and a huge 100+ long tree, with branches and roots attached, would be floating at high speed right toward you. If you was in the middle of the river at the time, you'd have to brace against the controls and wait for the tree to hit either the boat or the cables. Hitting the ferry was easier. You could rock yourself free and move past it. When a tree, especially the root ball, hit the cable, you were screwed. It would tangle in the cable, and you couldn't move forward. If you went back to the shore you came from, the cable would be pulled so far, your landings would be messed up, and it would take 2 hours at least for a crew to come down, get in the dinghy with a chainsaw, and break the tree up. So you'd call it in, but then you'd steer the boat out to the tree, and ram it at full speed, back up, and ram it again, and again and again and again. The whole time hoping that whoever tied the cable down to the shore did a damn good job. You could feel the intense pressure on the cable as you backed up and rammed the tree again. Once, I had 2 cars on board, and a car waiting on the other side. It took 20 minutes of ramming the tree for enough branches and roots to break off and float away. Another time, a tree slid past the cable, but I didn't see it, and pushed it toward the landing under the apron of the boat. I couldn't land. There was a 12-diameter tree trunk between me and the landing. Tangled in the weeds, the cable, the boat, all of it. I couldn't get close enough to let cars on or off. I was stuck. It took hours for a crew to come down and free me. Once, the power cut out while I was in the middle of the river. We were powered from an overhead line. with a long extension cord, only 8 inches thick, running between the boat and the power. When you died in the middle, the only option was to move the ferry with the rescue boat. This was a tiny aluminum boat with an outboard motor. It sat, attached to the ferry, hanging over the water. You'd lower it into the water, start it up, and the tiny outboard motor would eventually move the 40-ton boat toward shore. Very, very slowly. It took over an hour, with passengers on board. Last deployment. Russian fighter jets flying right above us taking photos was pretty unsettling. Then on SIPR share drive we saw the photos of the Russians taking photos of us, and it's literally some dude in the back of the jet with a Casio. Intrusive thoughts of jumping in. I used to work on a yacht, and when I was on night watch I had this thought constantly. I thought it was super messed up. But now that I see this comment, I'm happy I'm not the only one, lol. You know the feeling of being in a full stadium? 10,000s of people all within sight of each other. All together? Multiply that by 100 and maybe that would be like the sea of sea mammals I was in the middle of. Presumably on a bunch of food below. Squid or something. There were half a dozen species of dolphin and half a dozen species of whales all together going completely crazy, busting the surface white. Hundreds of thousands, I'm guessing. Going into the forecastle of the small 42 feet lobster boat was like entering a different reality. Through the hull you could hear. They were all talking to one another, and I could say you could hear them, but it was something else entirely. The bones in my skull and the rest of my body were vibrating at every frequency. Heard and sub and supersonic alike in alien rhythms and repeating patterns. A once-in-a-lifetime sensation. Lasted about half an hour. Highly recommended. When I stood watch I would make it a point to see at least one shooting star. There aren't uncommon when you don't have light pollution. My dad was competing in a marlin fishing comp near Weipa, the pointy top bit of Australia. Battled a fish for 4 hours. They catch and release. As it neared the boat, crew ready to haul it on board, and a camera team went in for the tight shot. Hanging right over the edge, the marlin breached the water, and then a huge great white shark breached under it. Full length above the water, inches from the crew's faces. Shark took the whole marlin, plus a big bite out of the boat. All caught on camera. Everyone was pretty shaken for a while after. I'll never forget the pics of the bite mark. Exactly like people do to crackers. With individual tooth marks. But a meter plus wide. Edit to add. Sorry. Footage was the property of the TV station who was filming. I have an old VHS tape of it somewhere. I should get it digitalized. I'm betting there are plenty of similar incidences on YouTube though. Those fishing boats carry rifles for a reason.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epic Aircast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.